Okay, so second panel.
Many thanks, Philip, for organising us here today. As many people have already pointed out, Sally has been a pioneer in bringing an anthropological eye to international institutions. I think while international lawyers like me are drawn to the written word, treaties, UN resolutions, general comments and recommendations, and court decisions, those are our bread and butter, Sally has investigated the social life of these institutions, exposing the intricacies of their operation. And she has illuminated the way that international norms are received and deployed at the local level. I first encountered Sally's work through the book that's already been much referred to here, Human Rights and Gender Justice, published in 2006. And of course, as we've already been reminded, this book investigates... Oh, Philip, I've only put on my timer now. I've got an extra minute. This is how I first met Sally, as it were, through her book. And this book investigates how the United Nations came to define violence against women as a human rights violation, and studies in particular the operation of the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women of 1979. Well, this book was a revelation to me. Somebody said to me, "You're interested in CEDAW, you might want to look at this book." And it was quite a moment where I felt the scales fell from my eyes. Whereas I'd grown up, I was trained and always had measured progress in terms of jurisprudential clarity and expansive accounts of legal norms. But Sally's book really emphasised the way that communities actually used human rights instruments and drew attention to the culture of the United Nations. So, inspired by Sally's intrepid scholarship, which ventures beyond the legal text of international institutions, what I want to do today is to look at the way that these institutions use visual images of women. Now, images, of course, and Sam Martinez has already very powerfully reminded of this, are one way of understanding the international and understanding international institutions. And in the context of gender in particular, visuality is a critical aspect of global politics. It's essential to the way that gender, the concept of gender, is understood and communicated. And of course, it can also allow ways to challenge associated cultural practices. So I want to focus on one particular set of images, which are those associated with the so-called Women, Peace and Security agenda of the UN Security Council, which was inaugurated in the year 2000 by Security Council Resolution 1325. And this is one of the many graphics you can find on the UN's website when you look up Women, Peace and Security. So the resolution is sort of taken as very, very significant because it was the first time that the UN Security Council specifically addressed women's experience in conflict and post-conflict. And it's been supplemented since that one resolution by 8 further resolutions, the most recent having been adopted just earlier this year. So the language of, if you actually read the text of the resolution, and I'm not going to show you the text, but it presents women as both agents and victims. So the agenda rests on both the idea that women are naturally more peaceful than men and thus very useful in dispute resolution, and also the idea that women and girls are perennial victims who have what are called special needs. That term is referred to a lot. 1325 calls for, and I'm quoting from it here, increased representation of women at all decision-making levels in national, regional and international institutions for the prevention, management and resolution of conflict. The resolution also encourages states to respect international legal instruments dealing with the rights of women. Another feature of 1325 is that it uses the term gender extensively. It has a whole lot of variants of this. It talks about gender perspectives, gender sensitivity and so on. And when you try and work out, well, what does this resolution actually mean each time it uses the word gender, it comes back to this term special needs, talking about, well, women and girls. It doesn't really identify what the special needs are, but it identifies, well, women and girls have these during repatriation, settlement and reconstruction. it also says gender means protecting the human rights of women and girls in any new legal order. Well, what's extraordinary, even though the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and it's got, of course, its own acronym, the WPS Agenda, has been endorsed many times over. The UN, it's striking, there's also a counter-narrative inside the UN admitting that it has been, it's had remarkably little impact. And we have, for example, Radhika Kumaraswamy's 2015 report on the operation of Security Council Resolution 1325, which in a very sustained way, a very lengthy and detailed and impressive way, just says, okay, this has been very problematic in the sense it's had very little impact. And there's an annual, the Secretary General of the UN issues an annual report on how Resolution 1325 is going. And I've just noted every Secretary General, there's part of it where there's a whole lament in this. So the security, just to take this year's report, acknowledging the slow progress, this is typical of the language, this is the current Secretary General Guterres. I remain concerned about lack of progress across most fundamental commitments to peace and security, human rights and gender equality. So there are a lot of statistics available about how, despite all these calls of the resolution, it's had very little impact if we just take the simple metric of involving women in peace negotiations. So between 1990 and 2017, 2% of chief mediators, 8% of negotiators, and 5% of witnesses and signatories in peace processes were women. And it's, in the last year, of course, there have been many peace talks. One just has to look at the imagery generally that have excluded women, such as in Syria and Yemen. So there's a whole raft of, and I know we have to be suspicious about these quantification, but it's pretty well agreed that 1325 has had extremely little impact even inside the UN itself. This is a figure from the UN website. In 2019, less than 8% of peace agreements contain gender-related provisions, whatever they are, compared to 30% in 2015. So the situation seems to be going backwards. So while the UN regularly wrings its hands at the lack of progress on the WPS agenda, it just keeps saying we've got to try more strongly. But certainly the radical transformation of the field of conflict that feminists envisioned certainly hasn't been delivered on. What I want to do is to show some images taken from both UN and NATO websites in relation to the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and to consider their logics of representations of women, to shed light on, and using the words of Wendy Hesford, the visual economy of human rights internationalism. So the question I want to ask is, what mode of thought is being evoked in our engagement with representations used on these official websites? What's highlighted, what's hidden within the frame, what worldviews are represented and which are downplayed? So the argument I want to make is that attention to the visual or the aesthetic illustrates very strongly the ambivalence inside the UN about women's roles in conflict, which echoes or perhaps underpins the faltering of the agenda in the numerical sense. So I think the frames, the official framing of 1325 reproduce existing asymmetries of power. So women and children are the quintessential victims in all humanitarian imagery, as many scholars have pointed out. As soon as you have women and children in the frame, you get the signal of passivity, innocence, and non-violence. And images of men are typically read in quite different ways. You don't get a lot of funding if you put up images of vulnerable men. In the context of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, I've identified, and there probably are many more, at least 6 variations on this. So first of all, the women are still seen as quite exotic actors on the international scene. And I think this is illustrated in this graphic here quite well. I take the image of the woman that's a cutout there, if you look in the middle, perhaps as, I take the message as probably if you observe the Women, Peace and Security agenda, you will, this is the happy state, I assume that's looking like a cheerful woman. This is the archetype of the truly peaceful and secure woman. But if you look at it closely, it seems to have been borrowed from an advertisement for hair shampoo or something like that, and depicts the woman at the heart of the Security Council activity. Certainly you can see that she's Western, most likely, youthful, and really glamorous. So that seems to be, it's a very problematic graphic, I think, in itself. The second image we get is that women are peaceful. This is an image from the UN website of women in Burundi, and they are, this is depicting the women who need 1325. So how do we know that these women are peaceful? Well, they've got children with them and they're not carrying weapons. So that's a pretty clear guide to their peaceful nature. These women are taken to be non-threatening, and they ascribe a very, these images and the text surrounding them, they ascribe a very limited range of capacities. They are basically protectors of children. And even when we look at related images of women peacekeepers, and there are many of these, this is the image chosen to illustrate this year's UN Peacekeepers Day. And then we even have some of women with guns here. Even these women, even though they're carrying guns, they're depicted as more peaceful. And I was struck by the UN Secretary General in his report just this year on how 1325 is going. He said, and this is a quote, "In patrol units, women can better access intelligence to provide a holistic view of security challenges. And at checkpoints, they promote a less confrontational atmosphere." So this is really why we want women, because even when they've got guns, they are innately more peaceful. So women here are a check on men in that sense. And a third general trend we can see in the images is that women from the South are the quintessential victims of conflict. So I showed you the first graphic with the glamorous advertisement for doing something with your hair, I think. But despite that, all the other imagery, the apparent beneficiaries of the Women, Peace and Security agenda are all from the Global South. They are the quintessential spectacle of victimhood, and there's a double dose of gendering going on here. So women from the West, as you can see here, only appear in the guise of security providers. They are the people who provide the security. A fourth element we can see across the imagery is that, paradoxically perhaps, the use of force is a guarantee of peace. So in order to get peace, you have to use force. So the Women, Peace and Security agenda addresses the effects of war, but certainly not its causes in all of these images. And the use of force is absolutely central to achieving peace. So security means the absence of conflict, but it is the state and the armed force that provide the security. So feminist calls for disarmament, arms control and reducing military spending in favour of social investment, for example, are quite out of any of these frames. Another more recent regular image of women that appear and of gender that appear across the official imagery is that women are like canaries in the coal mine. They're early detectors of problems. So since 2015 Women, Peace and Security Resolution 2242, most of the resolutions assign women a special role, excuse me, a new role in countering violent extremism and terrorism. The idea is that women often have greater access to places and people that may reveal potential security risks. Because they're peaceful and because they're trustworthy, they might sense them before everybody else does. So women are presented as vigilant mothers and neighbourhood experts who can quickly detect people becoming radicalised and be willing to inform the authorities. So this is actually an image from the Swiss Peace website depicting a meeting last year in Mogadishu. And it's the idea of women as super sleuths. So the female subject of security now becomes an object of, an agent, I should say, of security. So she's both an object of security, a subject of security, but she's also capable of contributing to security by her intuition. And finally, the image that comes across in all the official ones is that gender has a single meaning. It's all about women. So this, we'll see a number of images both taken from the UN and also from NATO websites. So while the language of gender is omnipresent in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, it's clear that this is simply a synonym for women. So there's no reflection in any of the imagery or the language of masculine identities in times of conflict or violent patterns of conduct accepted because they are coded as male. So gender has become, in the language and the imagery of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, a static monolithic category, always involving women as victims. So gender security is defined as simply women in need of protection. Now, men and masculinity. Well, men are occasionally referred to in some of the Women, Peace and Security resolutions, but only fleetingly. And they do appear, as you can see here, in some of the visual imagery, but it's always they're there as a safe pair of hands, in no other guise. So depicting... is that 5 minutes or is it 2, Philip?
2.
So one of the problems, as many scholars have pointed out, is depicting gender as a synonym for women reduces the force of that term. First, because it also obscures the fact, of course, that men have a gender and inhabit a gendered world, and the role of masculinity in global politics. And second, because it implies that gender identity is fixed rather than constructed as a social practice. It misses the fact that gendering of identity intersects with factors such as race, class, sexuality, age, and so on. So the impact of these images and the text means that the UN operationalised Resolution 1325 and its successor resolutions in a way that never questions the existing gendered system and restricts any potential transformative potential it may have. So these are some of the other images. This is an image from the Côte d'Ivoire. The very narrow account of gender, which is deployed in international institutions, allows problems facing women to be understood as the product of particular cultures, or the fact of lack of participation in public arenas, or lack of informational skills. And I was very struck by looking at the UN website how many of the images are like this. Images, so to depict the agenda, you have images of women sitting in conferences or classrooms gaining information. That seems to be the main goal here. So the international resort to the language of gender requires women to change, or a change in the participation of women. So it's become above all a technical issue, a head count of women and men. So there is no indication of the relationships of domination and subordination that might be behind some of the conflicts in these issues. So to conclude, what work are these visual images doing? First of all, it's very important to remember that the visual, of course, can be one source of oppression of women. And I was struck by, earlier this year, the UN commander, Major Kirsten Lund, one of the very few women involved in UN peacekeeping, observed that the presence of posters with naked women on them in UN peacekeepers' quarters had created an atmosphere that led many women to leave. And she was proud of the fact that one of the things she'd done was to get rid of that imagery. But the visual is clearly a critical means by which ideas are circulated internationally. So the idea of gender we're getting from the UN is tied up with vulnerability, dependence, and the need of protection. And in this sense, these images are providing an alibi for UN and international engagement. We can see that in the in national legal systems, and this is an image of justice from the Vancouver law courts, but also in international imagery, there's another from the International Court of Justice. Although women are never depicted as actual actors in international law, it's striking that many images of justice depict a woman based on ancient goddesses of justice. And Martin O'Loughlin, a British scholar, has speculated that this is precisely because women were not involved as judges in legal processes. It meant that the female figure could stand as an ideal of justice, untainted by reality. So this wasn't a fellow human being, but rather, in O'Loughlin's words, a pure medium through which the channel of justice flows. But I just want to end with one of the most striking of the UN's depictions of women, the UN's Wonder Woman. So in 2016, the UN appointed Wonder Woman as ambassador for the empowerment of women and girls. This was, of course, just after a failed year-long campaign to get the UN to appoint its first UN Secretary General, and there were 7 women as candidates. So, of course, you can see this is not just a cartoon of a woman, it's a Barbie-like image of impossible physical proportions. In other words, it's a sexualised fantasy. And the UN officials responsible for the choice said that this was actually feminism in action. They'd modified Wonder Woman by showing her just from the waist up and placing a cloak modestly over her shoulders. I should say, of course, there was a huge outcry, and the campaign was abandoned after 2 months. But I think that we can see, in a sense, the UN's visual images of women in the context of women, peace and security have reinforced the idea that women have a peaceful nature and that they're not ready for an active role in world affairs, but the only person yet deemed capable of having an active role in world affairs is a fantasy character. Well, I must say one of the great pleasures of the last decade for me has been to be able to meet Sally in person during her visits to the Australian National University and to work with her on various projects, including the International Panel on Social Progress, and there are some of our colleagues in the room, which has been great fun. Particularly enjoyable for me has been the chance to teach a course with her last year at Melbourne Law School, and I was able to see right up close Sally's great warmth, her diplomacy, and her insight, and that's been an absolutely marvellous academic experience. I think Sally has a really brilliant capacity to map ideas and concepts, but another really strong feature of her work is its optimism and hope. So in the conclusion to her book on human rights and gender violence, a book which has got a very subtle but absolutely thoroughgoing critique of the UN human rights system, she writes, and these are her words, "Human rights serves those in power, but is always in danger of escaping its bounds and working in a genuinely emancipatory way." So in the spirit of Sally's optimism, I think in the context of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the challenge is to identify visual techniques that will increase the emancipatory potential at which she gestures.
This will be interesting as a counterpoint. Some more visual images. So I'm not going to go on at length about just Sally, because I think, you know, we all share that, but it's been just a kind of extraordinary part of my intellectual life to get to know her as a mentor, as an interlocutor, and then as a friend. I can remember being very kind of fangirl-like when I first met her, and I love that now we've evolved into you know, a striking and just really important to me relationship. And her work will become very evident as I go through this project. And again, it will be an interesting counterpoint to Hillary's paper and to some extent to Samuel's. So on April 8th, 2010, over 1,500 Maasai women from many different villages converged on Loliondo, the headquarters of the Ngorongoro district in Tanzania. The women had come together to turn in their membership cards to the long-time ruling political party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, or CCM. Many of them disobeyed stern police warnings that they would be shot if they walked to Loliondo. Others were forcibly returned by the police to their villages by trucks. Nonetheless, hundreds hid with their small children in the bushes overnight until the CCM office opened, then marched to the office and turned in 1,883 party membership cards. By renouncing their membership in CCM, the women explained that they were protesting 2 recent government actions. The first was the eviction of thousands of Maasai from their area in July 2009, which included, I'm flipping slides here. Okay, there we go, which included burning their homesteads, confiscating thousands of cattle, beating up men, and raping some of the women. And the second was a recently announced government plan to alienate even more village land by creating a buffer zone along the boundary of the Serengeti National Park. As they left to walk the many miles back to their villages, they sang, "We are not for CCM, which sells our land." As one of the women told a reporter, quote, "We have come to know our rights as women and as a community. This is our initiative." The response of the government, political party, and mainstream media was shocked disbelief at the capacity for women, especially illiterate rural Maasai women, to organize themselves. They instead accused various male civil society leaders of instigating the actions. This protest is just one of an array of actions that women who self-identify as Maasai in northern Tanzania have staged over the past decade or so to challenge these land dispossessions by demanding justice from CCM and from the Tanzanian state. In 2003, about 500 women from the same area gathered together, cut sticks, stripped themselves naked, and then stood on a local airstrip to prevent planes filled with hunters from the UAE from landing. The women were upset that the group, which had already received a huge land concession from the Tanzanian government, was encroaching on land beyond the boundaries of their lease to hunt, failing to provide promised development support to surrounding villages, and hiring outsiders rather than residents for jobs in the compound. Similarly, in April 2013, over 2,000 women mobilized together to challenge yet another effort by the government to remove Maasai from over 1,500 square kilometers of their titled village lands for a new wildlife corridor by occupying the contested land for 10 days. According to one leader, quote, "Women are gathering and demonstrating because without land, there is no life for them." The persistence of female collective action as a strategy for voicing and challenging injustice suggests, I think, possible limitations to and frustrations with more legalistic modes of action promoted by courts, states, and even national and transnational feminist organizations. How and why are Maasai women, like other African women, expressing their grievances over land dispossession through collective protests, despite colonial and post-colonial efforts to channel the expression and resolution of disputes through more legalistic channels? Why is collective protest the preferred form of seeking justice for these women? So in my talk today, and forgive my voice, I have a bad cold. In my talk today, I will examine the symbolism and substance of these actions and their historical roots and customary forms of female collective protest. My purpose is to suggest that although legal rights-based approaches have been effective in certain realms, their current dominance obscures other gender forms of challenging injustice that express other priorities, forms of power, and ideas of justice. My analysis is based on contemporary accounts of these actions and over 30 years of historical and ethnographic research with self-identified Maasai communities in Tanzania. And it draws from my recent book, Gender Justice and the Problem of Culture, From Customary Law to Human Rights in Tanzania. So in 2010, the raising of bomas, or the homesteads, and threatened expansion of the buffer zone were just the latest in a long history of efforts by the state to take away Maasai land for more productive and profitable endeavors throughout northern Tanzania, but especially in Ngorongoro district. My slides are all funky. All right, sorry. As the site of both the Serengeti National Park and the Ngorongoro Conservation Authority, Ngorongoro District has long been at the center of conflicts between such different interests as community rights to land and livelihoods, big game hunting, which is still legal in Tanzania, wildlife conservation, commercial agriculture, and tourism. Incidents of land grabbing by the state have intensified in recent decades in the wake of neoliberal economic reforms that have revised land laws and encouraged foreign investment, especially in the lucrative tourism and big game hunting sectors. As elsewhere in Tanzania, Maasai have become increasingly impoverished with the loss of their land, and thus the foundation of their primary livelihood, herding cattle and small stock. As Coco, an elderly woman whom I have known for years, explained to me in 2005, and I quote, "Life has become much more difficult since you left, and I'd last seen her in 2001. There is no rain, no water, and no wood, and people are sicker and hungrier. It seems that people, especially children, are dying more often in these past years. One problem is that people are selling their land to outsiders and others. Someone has problems, and then they sell their lands for money, and then the land is gone. We Maasai are like an old ripped cloth. It keeps getting tattered and torn, and soon there will be nothing left. According to Nayu, another Maasai woman, quote, "Women now sing about land issues and talk about men and the consequences of land sales. They tell the men, we are not birds. We cannot just move from tree to tree once our land is gone." They accuse the men of finishing them, of selling out and not thinking about the future. These poignant comments convey the deep-seated anxiety about the tremendous losses of land upon which pastoralism depended. For these women, there was no future without land. The phrase, "we are not birds," captures the essential issue. Humans, especially agrarian peoples who depend on herding and farming for their livelihoods, need land. The rapidly diminishing land base, especially of fertile lands, devastated the livestock herds, heightened the migration of young men, and often increasingly older married men, to urban centers, and forced men and women, both young and old, to seek new ways to diversify their livelihoods. The loss of their land has been accompanied and enabled by their continuing marginalization from political power, disparagement and denigration of their social and cultural practices and appearance, and inequities in the provision of quality, accessible education and health care. Maasai men and women whom I interviewed in 2005, 2006, 2011 were very aware of these injustices, describing their urgent needs as hunger, poverty, lack of clean, accessible water, and for many, lack of functioning, affordable health facilities. In response to these incursions into their land, lives, and livelihoods, Maasai communities have responded with the kinds of everyday forms of resistance described by James Scott, most notably trespassing with their livestock to graze and water on prohibited lands. In addition, many of the male-dominated NGOs, CSOs, CBOs that have emerged over the past decades in the area have tried to challenge these evictions and other actions through court cases, policy debates, publicity campaigns, investigative reports, national and international advocacy, and more, mostly to no avail. Although several prominent male Maasai activists have been trained as lawyers recently, they have become disheartened and embittered by the pervasive corruption of the Tanzanian legal system and the unwillingness of judges and magistrates to challenge the interests of dominant political elites. In contrast to these failed legal efforts, the various collective actions by Maasai women, especially the April 2010 protests, have garnered substantial media attention and intensified the pressure on local and state officials to acknowledge Maasai rights and resolve the conflicts. But the 2010 protest in Loliondo was hardly an anomaly for Maasai women or African women more generally. African women, as some of you might know, have a long documented history of collective protests, from pre-colonial Pokot so-called shaming parties in Kenya to the infamous Igbo Women's War in Nigeria, to the recurrent protests by Nigerian women against Shell oil today. Among Maasai, as elsewhere on the continent, these forms of female collective protests are recognized by both men and women as legitimate expressions of women's moral authority to punish people who violate the social order and to demand justice on behalf of themselves and their families. In the past, these violations usually involve serious affronts to women's responsibilities and rights as mothers, daughters, and wives. For example, according to a colonial report from 1910, quote, "In the event of a man having intercourse with a pregnant woman and thereby causing her to abort, he must submit to a punishment which is called okishoroto. All the women of the neighborhood collect together and, having stripped, seize the guilty person and flog him, after which they slaughter as many of his cattle as they can, strangling and suffocating the animals with their garments." Similar reports of okishoroto continue to the present over such violations as a man who has sex with his real or classificatory daughter, or men who prevent their wives from participating in their regular collective fertility gatherings. By the 1970s, however, women had expanded the targets of okishoroto to include elected officials, party members, and other Maasai and non-Maasai leaders. In 1977, for example, in response to a government decree that Maasai men and women had to wear so-called modern dress, shirts, shorts, skirts, dresses, and so forth, in order to be able to ride buses to town, quote, a large group of women from all over the South got together to curse the Maasai leader of the community. Then they began collecting money for an en masse trip to Dar es Salaam to present their complaints to the president. The curse was eventually removed by a judicious slaughtering of a number of cattle, and the women persuaded not to make the trip to Dar. In the North, a national parliamentarian was also cursed. The actions of these officials, the women believed, were threatening their responsibilities and power as mothers to support, nourish, and protect their families, especially their children. As mothers, their responsibilities included not just ensuring the physical well-being of their children through providing food, healing of illnesses, and so forth, but their moral and cultural well-being as well. So how do we make sense of these protests? What insights can they provide into the meanings and modes of expressing and experiencing gender justice on the part of Maasai women, and the potential limitations of more formal legal approaches? These cases, like others, suggest that we need to look beyond rights-based frameworks to explore and compare the experience and effectiveness of other modes of gender justice. Gender justice refers to the diverse ways of defining and seeking justice between and among men and women, as well as the gendered assumptions and implications of these different justice regimes. These regimes may include human rights, international and national laws and protocols, customary and religious modes of dispute resolution, and collective action, among others. They often presume and deploy distinct ideas of justice, personhood, agency, morality, and power, and employ different mechanisms for implementing and enforcing outcomes. A gendered analysis therefore includes, but also moves beyond questions of whether women have rights, what rights they have, and whether they have gained or lost rights, to explore the centrality of gendered ideas and assumptions to the formulation, promotion, and enforcement of justice. Thus, while the substance and scale of women's demands in Loliondo are perhaps relatively new, challenging evictions, land alienation, corrupt officials, and the resulting increases in the insecurity of their families and livelihoods, the form collective protest has a long history, one based as elsewhere in the moral authority and political power of women as mothers. Although I wasn't present at the Loliondo protests, the published and unpublished accounts that I have read all agree that most, if not all, of the women had small children with them, a clear statement that they were drawing on their status as mothers to protest and critique those who they saw as responsible for undermining their ability to care for their children and ensure their secure and successful futures. These women, in other words, perceive the state-led land disposition and other actions as immoral, as violations of not just the social order, but the sacred order, and as an assault on their rights and responsibilities as mothers. So in contrast to rights-based frameworks, the idea of justice deployed and pursued by Maasai women is predicated on distinct concepts of morality, collective responsibility, and the relationship between the sacred and the secular. Rights-based approaches to justice usually presume an individual, secular, gendered subject, often make it difficult to recognize and address the structural causes and contexts of gender injustice, and assume that the state is a protector of rights rather than a perpetrator of injustice. Maasai women, however, derive their moral authority from their close relationship to their primarily female divinity Ngai, and thus see themselves as having a moral obligation to challenge perceived violations of the social order, whether from incestuous men in the past or corrupt state and party officials in the present. Moreover, they emphasize the need and power of challenging these perceived injustices collectively, not as individuals. Their collective actions express the importance of social connections and relationships rather than individual autonomy and rights, address the structural and challenge the structural inequalities produced by colonialism and capitalism that have alienated them and their families from lands and livelihoods, and directly challenge the involvement of the Tanzanian state, the primary political party, and even foreign hunting companies in facilitating their disenfranchisement and oppression. By drawing on their long tradition of collective protest and modifying it to address current forms of injustice, Maasai women have emerged as a powerful political force to be reckoned with by the state and political party. As one Tanzanian reporter noted when commenting on the Loliondo protests, quote, "In the past, the Maasai were renowned for their warrior force, the Morans. The age set still open and close to new spear carriers, but today the formal army of the Maasai is their women." Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much to Philip. I know we're trying today, but I doubt we'll be successful at capturing the impact that Sally has had on anthropology and on law. She has either formed or helped to form not just one, but multiple fields, as we can see from the program. It's breathtaking how much she has published. She has formed a whole diaspora of students, many of whom are now professors, and they in turn continue her mandate in various fields. I'm happy to say I'm part of this diaspora. I first encountered Sally's work as a graduate student in a class on law and culture taught by my advisor, co-chair, Jane Collier, who was a very good friend and colleague of Sally's. If Jane was my academic mother, then Sally was my favorite academic auntie. Of course, she has since become much, much more a mentor, a colleague, and a friend. I'm so grateful for that. So today I want to enter her work through the one particular door, and that's of gender, even though I'm thrilled to have been recently adopted into her study of infrastructures. So I'll first discuss her work and then trace how it's influenced my own. So Sally helped to shift the anthropology of law from its mission as the study of law, order, and conflict in non-Western societies to studying at home and studying law as a form of power. From studying legal pluralism, then, she moved to studying law as a form of colonial power and as a transnational regime. And as part of this, she took on topics that no one had before, including domestic violence. It sounds strange to say this now, since what we call gender violence or gender-based violence, as we said, or GBV or VAW, is the center of so many movements and practices, from human rights to humanitarian work to the global Me Too movement. Victims of gender-based violence are in fact model victims and increasingly legal political subjects. But as far as I know, no one was studying it in the way Sally was in the late 1980s and early 1990s when she started in Hawaii, thinking about how domestic violence was adjudicated in legal courts as a physical act rather than taking into account the gendered relations of power in which it was embedded. But the 1990s also saw the ascendancy of the movement for human rights. As Ruchi Taitel argues, humanity's law, human rights, the laws of war, and international criminal law became increasingly important in the post-Cold War period. Sally traced how the local debates about domestic violence increasingly got taken in by and transformed by transnational human rights discourses. We've already heard about this. So from the mid-1990s to 2006, and then subsequently in other books, Sally tracked how domestic violence or wife beating became violence against women, and then finally gender-based violence and gender violence, and how it came to be framed and adjudicated by human rights conventions. Most importantly, she tracked how it led to new subjectivities and forms of human rights consciousness. As she writes, violence against women was not easily defined as a human rights violation initially because many of the assaults are perpetrated by private citizens rather than states. Human rights documents and conventions had to shift to punishing states who didn't hold their own private citizens accountable. So after sustained lobbying transnationally, the discourse on violence against women was created as the lowest common denominator of the women's movements in the global North and South, taking the issue of bodily integrity as their common base. Then it was adopted by CEDAW, amongst other committees and commissions. As Sally writes, it took as its substrate a universal space of pain and suffering that could be understood across cultural and physical differences. Yet it nevertheless could not help but be caught up in the messiness of cultural understandings of gender, sexuality, the institutions of marriage, divorce, child custody, and even in the very meaning of pain itself. In other words, as Sally says, gender violence staged many of the so-called contradictions between culture and rights. Sally explores how culture gets deployed in rights regimes as harmful, as tradition, as backward, as superfluous. She traces how those in so-called local situations working at the grassroots with so-called cultural practices negotiate with the transnational elites who meet at global conferences and lay out the terms of human rights as if above culture, cultureless. The book, this is the gender violence, Human Rights and Gender Violence book, is precisely about understanding this local global interface and the way culture gets mobilized in and through it to shape the meanings of gender violence. Sally's work traces how gender and gender violence became framed as a universal problem and how gender itself began to be negotiated in different realms beyond the local and the private. Indeed, she shows how it became recognized as a particular aspect of the human that requires special protections. In this sense, she opened up a field of study to think about the relationships between gender and the human and how these are both imagined and adjudicated. So my own work takes up the relation between gender and the human in the space that Sally opened, and it does so in two ways, one of which follows directly in Sally's work and the other of which cross-cuts it. So first I want to speak about gender and gender-based violence in relation to humanitarianism. And second, I want to take up her concept of culture as it's used in rights discourses and think about it in relation to the concept of innocence. So first then to humanitarianism. So just as gender-based violence was not an obvious human rights problem, it was decidedly not a humanitarian concern. Humanitarians are primarily concerned with saving lives and relieving suffering. Humanitarianism of the sort practiced by Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, is most significantly focused on health and the lives and well-being of populations. They engage at the level of the suffering body. What mobilizes action is the ahistorical victim. This is a body outside time and place, outside history and politics, one that can therefore be universally recognized. The key to its power and its appeal is its unquestioned universality. That is, the underlying assumption is that we can recognize suffering wherever we see it because there's a common denominator to being human, located in our bodies, and particularly in our bodies in pain. But how does one find this universal suffering human? What does it look like? Where is the pure life in crisis fetishized by humanitarians, the life outside politics? Clearly, gender violence does not fit here. Gender relations, as we've already heard, are relations of power. As both an analytic category and a social process, gender is relational. It has no meaning or existence alone. Immediately, then, we enter into politics and into power. Gender relations might be relations of domination or subordination, or of mutual respect or interdependence. Indeed, before the early 2000s, survivors of sexual violence were not included in standard models of humanitarian aid delivery. In the collection of essays by MSF about humanitarian practices in the Congo Republic in the late 1990s, Civilians Under Fire, it's a book edited by Le Pape and Salignan, former MSF USA Executive Director Nicolas de Torrente and former MSF President Jean-Hervé Bradol admit that this is because relief organizations search for ideal victims. And as Bradol suggests, the raped woman rarely represents the ideal victim. This is because such survivors raised a number of unsettling issues for practitioners around violence and gender roles, which they felt were too political to engage. As a result, de Torrente states that MSF reproduced forms of prejudice against women in general and survivors of sexual violence in particular. The ideal victim can be read as a search for someone outside politics, as a search for purity. What I found was that it was articulated in the language of innocence. To return to Sally's work, this is the shape of the universal substrate somehow beneath culture, that is the essential subject of human rights, stripped of culture, but it now wears the robes of innocence. So even if the goal of humanitarianism is to treat everyone equally, the concept of innocence helps in this process as a way to grasp and measure vulnerability. Indeed, former MSF President Ronnie Brauman has criticized how moralist positions have marked humanitarianism, noting that the symbolic status of the victim can, in effect, and I'm quoting, only be granted in cases of unjustified or innocent suffering. The point is the victim must be 100% victim, a non-participant. In many ways, MSF's collection of essays marks the shift in the humanitarian mandate. Sexual violence, as we all know, merits an immediate response from aid workers. This was not because humanitarianism stopped looking for innocent subjects. Rather, there was a shift to seeing these women as innocent enough to be compelling humanitarian subjects. This happened in large part through the medicalization of gender-based violence, which is the longer story related to its changing treatment not just by the regimes of human rights, but also of global health. Attention was transferred to health consequences such as infection with HIV, physical injury and trauma, unwanted pregnancies, reproductive health, and STDs. Indeed, a shift in language helped to make it a public health and a humanitarian problem. It was designated an epidemic of sexual violence. This did not happen before the 1990s, this language, and then it became a pandemic. This medicalization of rape and sexual violence ended up shifting the blame and rendering the victims innocent of the harm they endured. More specifically, a focus on the vulnerable body in biomedical terms brackets off social and political identities and realities. It removes the gendered scaffolding of rape. The medicalization was helpful insofar as it allowed women to be abstracted from their political contexts, rendered blameless, and treated. It has been less helpful, however, insofar as it has worked to depoliticize the larger gendered inequalities that lead to such harm. Tracing how gender entered into the humanitarian mandate prompted me to take on the concept of innocence and try to understand how it functions. So I'm looking specifically at its ethical, moral dimensions, less at its juridical meanings. So the book I'm currently writing investigates how discourses and images of innocence get assembled and weaponized across the fields of immigration, gender politics, racial politics, and environmentalism, largely in the Euro-American context, post-1960s. But here I want to think about innocence for a moment in relation to the way culture gets mobilized in rights discourses. Indeed, it often functions as the opposite of culture. If Sally asks, who speaks for culture, I want to ask a related question, who speaks as innocent? Even as innocence is defined against politics as freedom from the worldly and unworldly, my argument is that innocence plays an increasingly powerful political role. Innocence is desirable because it promises a space outside corruption and contamination. It's commonly understood to be innocent is to be pure, without guile, without knowledge, and without intent. To be sure, innocence has many meanings. It comes into being in relation to various binary others, such as guilt, knowledge, and sexuality. While the concept does different work in relation to these binaries, in each case, innocence works to regulate a space of purity. For instance, in relation to sexuality, literary theorist James Kincaid describes innocence as simply virginity coupled with ignorance. Indeed, innocence is defined as freedom from sin, guilt, or moral wrong in general, freedom from specific guilt, and freedom from cunning or artifice. The space of freedom from this negative freedom is so free indeed that it's seemingly free of content. It purports to be a moral and epistemic state of purity. It's precisely this idea of purity that gives it its power. This is what allows it to work so stealthily, locating those who claim it outside accountability and responsibility. So let me come back now to how innocence plays in relation to the concept of culture as framed in rights discourses. So as Sally writes, the fight over culture in human rights discourses, and in discourses of women's rights in particular, often pits a set of cultureless modern societies against those that are tradition-bound. This understanding of culture underpinned the colonial civilizing missions, which intervened in the name of saving the natives, especially women, from their barbaric cultural practices. Colonial violence was rationalized in the name of tutelage, or betterment in these cases. In many ways, the culture-free zone that the colonizers claimed maps onto a zone of innocence. It sees itself as a space of pure humanity, emptied of specific reference and desires. Yet both the discourses of culture and innocence end up producing and enacting what Didier Fassin has called hierarchies of humanity, albeit slightly differently so in each case. Innocence enables a distinction between those who help, for instance, the human rights and humanitarian workers, or even the so-called benevolent colonial missionaries in other times, and those whom they help. So the distinction between the help and those whom they help. That is, innocence always carries with it the desire to protect and the impetus to take responsibility for those whom, in their want of knowledge, cannot take care of themselves. Guilelessness evokes the need for care. Innocents cannot take responsibility for themselves. But that means that it props up a feeling of control in those who care for the innocent. It assures them not only of their power, but also of their knowledge, insofar as the innocent person is oblivious. It creates a class of saviors. As a space of purity, innocence itself appears outside of history, and as such, it allows those who work as saviors to ignore the political and historical circumstances that created the victims. This not only allows saviors to feel powerful and knowledgeable, but also enables them to simultaneously capture innocence, to purify and absolve themselves. In other words, innocence also creates a savior class or subject, and they too make claims on innocence. If the people one is saving are understood as innocent outside time and place, and one is intervening only to stop the suffering, how can this not be considered innocent too? Here I want to draw attention to another meaning of innocence. While the Latin epistemology of innocence focuses on harm, mean innocens, not harmful, which is clearly a central feature of the concept, I want to draw attention to a different etymology, which is innoscere, not to know, which I think here is particularly significant. What does it mean not simply to be empty of knowledge, but specifically to not know? This can be a willful ignorance. In the context of the US history, James Baldwin understood such interventions in the terms of racial or white innocence. He described this impermissible innocence as Americans' refusal to deal with deeply entrenched forms of racial injustice by holding on to ideologies of equality that undergird the American dream rather than facing the actual historical evidence. Baldwin was describing the way Americans want to hold on to a fantasy of a race-blind present and future. Their ignorance allows the posture of innocence. Indeed, racial innocence is a form of deflection and not knowing or obliviousness that can be politically useful for those in power and that can prompt and justify further pursuits of innocence. In a similar vein, those inspired by humanitarian sentiments may try to bypass politics, claiming to act as witnesses to injustice or in response to the immediacy of suffering. But the political innocence they proclaim ignores the privilege that allows them to act. It's a refusal to acknowledge the structural inequalities that allow them to be humanitarians, witnesses, or saviors. It also ignores the desire to feel morally upstanding and to absolve oneself of the guilt that accompanies such interventions. Transnational feminist scholars have critiqued the yearning for innocence among certain feminists whose politics are grounded in their desire to save others, such as Muslim women, such as the trafficked women, and to not know about their complicities in the disenfranchisement of those they are saving. Claiming innocence, they frame their work as addressing the pure horror of gender violence. So in general, arguments based on innocence cast the majority outside the realm of care, framing only the exceptional as deserving. But they also encourage a form of politics that pushes politics to the limit of innocence in a never-ending quest for purity. Innocents are incapable of being thinking, engaged, active, or informed subjects. Paradoxically, while they're imbued with the ultimate value, in certain cases, they could be simultaneously the opposite of a normative humanity. Perhaps more to the point, they mark the borders of such a humanity. Innocents, that means the people, those who are innocent, can be those who are tradition-bound and naive, but they can also be those who call upon their ignorance to commit violence. In this sense, both innocence and culture act as the boundary for liberal ideas of personhood, where the constituent outside is simultaneously idealized and denigrated. Sally, your work has inspired me, taught me, pushed me to think, and I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart.